Picture this. Todd McFarlane, legendary comic book artist and creator of Spawn, meets Robert Kirkman, the writer and creator of both Invincible and The Walking Dead, at San Diego Comic-Con in 2006. From the audience of Todd's own panel, Robert point-blank asks McFarlane, "Hey, why don't you make your own comics anymore?" Todd's answer was simple: money! By that point, Todd had made his millions off the back of Spawn, millions he'd already spent on pissing Neil Gaiman off, and baseball. Lots and lots of baseball. Why make a new character or comic if it would only live in Spawn's shadow? Why not just make more Spawn? To Kirkman, the answer was simple: money! Kirkman had proven you can write more than one hit series concurrently and make a fuck ton of money in the process. All he needed to do was diversify that portfolio, give people something shiny and new to obsess over, and make fucking money! Todd couldn't argue with this logic, and he did have some ideas he wanted to experiment with, so he agreed to make something new if Robert helped him. In that single moment, comic book history should have been made. A meeting of two minds so vastly different but so wildly successful in the same field, challenging each other to make something that would not only be as profitable as their prior franchises, but just as iconic. If they brought their best people onto the project, combined some of their cash cow's most interesting elements, all while bringing something new to the table, these two titans of the Western comics industry could make the next big hero since, well, Spawn! But you read the title of this video, so let's get into it. Haunt, which debuted in October of 2009 and ended in December of 2012, tells the story of two brothers, rebellious priest Daniel and covert ops killer Kurt Kilgore. In typical fictional brother fashion, these two hate each other, or at least Daniel hates Kurt. Not because he kills people constantly and goes to him with Catholic guilt, instead it's because Kurt slept with Daniel's fiancée a long time ago. And because fate is cruel, the two later got married. This drove Daniel understandably insane, and after a period of soul-searching, to the cloth. So essentially, Kurt cucked his brother so hard, he became a priest. We're already off to a great start. After Kurt ends up killing his rescue target for his vaguely named agency due to them experimenting on human subjects, he's become sought after by the main crime lord of this series, Simon Herg. Herg believes he's in possession of the dead doctor's notebook, which contained his notes on accelerating cell regeneration and potentially immortality. But since Kurt doesn't have the notebook, Herg's men just torture him to death, promising to cut off the man's penis if he doesn't talk. They leave just enough of Kurt behind to give him a closed casket funeral, but Daniel soon finds himself haunted by his brother's ghost. Unable to do anything but argue with what he thinks is a delusion, Daniel spends the night with his ex-fiancée turned sister-in-law due to Kurt believing she's in danger. She of course is, and due to Kurt's first attempt at touching his brother since he became a ghost, fuses with Daniel. His ectoplasm forming a costume around him, allowing Daniel to decapitate both of his assailants with his bare hands. From here, Daniel is thrust into the world of espionage and proxy wars his brother took part in, joining his agency after showing off his powers, and learning from one of the evil doctor's test subjects that Kurt and Daniel are a haunt, something that, to her, shouldn't exist. With his head priest back home dead from another one of Herg's agents, and the agency itself desperate to get the notebook in their hands instead of Herg's, Daniel trains and acts as a member of the agency, not only getting revenge for what happened to his brother, however he may feel about him, but also seeking to understand the nature of their new powers. Now, the first thing you may notice about this book is the art, which is primarily done not by Todd McFarlane. Instead, for the first 5 issues, pencils and layouts were done both by Ryan Ottley, who's most famous for being the head artist of Invincible, but also Greg Capullo, who would remain on the book past Ottley, and later become the artist on DC's New 52 Batman series written by Scott Snyder. These two are incredibly gifted talents who each bring their A-game to this title. Action is bombastic and gory, with Ottley doing a lion's share of the first 3 issue spreads before Capullo takes the wheel. And while Ottley's art is dynamic, giving an almost beastly appearance in how the brothers move together, Capullo stresses the Spider-Man-esque acrobatics of Daniel, especially after his training arc, with less gore per fight scene. That doesn't mean he doesn't do it though. You can tell which artist is doing which page, especially when Todd does pencils in issue 18, but for the most part the styles don't clash with one another. There's good overlap between Ryan Ottley and Greg Capullo's art in these books, and I can only surmise it was both of their experiences with Big Two house style mandates. Same goes for the inking, first done by Todd himself before the duties were partially handed off to fellow Spawn inker Jonathan Glapion. And speaking of the Big Two, let's talk about Anti-Venom over here. This design is fascinating to me. While it fails the silhouette test unlike Todd's previous cash cow, it's still visually distinct. It predates the Ryan Stegman Venom designs with the spiral as a central motif. with his face mask being the more interesting design choice given his exposed mouth. A mouth that's clearly human, which gives his claw-like fingers and floating tendrils commonly seen around him an ethereal presence, like he's dressed like a monster, or turning into one. Which, given the lore explanation for the suit, is basically what it's doing. With every fusion the brothers undergo, the ectoplasm slowly eats away at Daniel's vitals the longer they stay together. If Kurt doesn't defuse from Daniel in time, he can not only kill his brother, but take over his body for good. So, Spawn and Letha, but without the cool countdown clock. Got it. Unlike Letha, Kurt can't make weapons other than goo claws or gliders. He's not limited by his imagination, he just sucks that much. He's much closer to, again, Venom! But the Spawn comparison is pretty multifaceted. The series of Haunt itself is basically what would happen if Spawn worked for the Global Defense Agency, right down to the discovery of genetically altered cyborgs and pseudo-religious iconography. And while I'm definitely undercutting the good of this book by giving it this description, it's definitely a comparison Haunt fails to ignore. But since it's a Kirkman comic, you're going to get some kind of interesting characterization for the leading family. Even if you can squint your eyes and say Daniel and Kurt's relationship is similar to Rick Grimes and Shane due to the cucking involved, the Kilgore brothers dynamic has less antagonistic development. At least, under Kirkman. While Kurt is very clearly in the wrong, given his multiple affairs and unscrupulous plans, he does seemingly care about his relationship with his younger brother. It's why he goes to confessional in the first place, to still justify his connection with his brother despite all the horrible things he's still coping with. If anything, Daniel is the one who's antagonistic. His arc is about slowly learning to trust his brother again given they're forced to work together, but also because, since he's the only one who can hear him, learning more about how his brother actually thinks. His justifications for bad actions, and how Daniel is the only one of the two unwilling to let bygones be bygones. This relationship is healed when Daniel starts training for his position at the agency, where he admits his resentment for his brother was solely driven by his own feelings of incompetence, learning to trust him again for the sake of his life, if not his brother's afterlife. However, Kurt, and by extension Daniel, are haunted by his past actions, more specifically the deal he made with his partner-turned-girlfriend Mirage. Given Mirage was the one who actually took the notebook Kurt was killed for, his goal was to inevitably run away with her by betraying both sides. And while Mirage does get the money that Kurt and her were owed, she doesn't take all of it, instead giving the half meant for Kurt to Amanda, feeling bad for effectively cucking her when Kurt and them were still together. This is just a triangle of cuckoldry, isn't it? Mirage does reappear throughout the series post-selling the notebook, but during Kirkman's run it's focused solely on the Amanda Kurt-Daniel aspect of her character, talking with Amanda about her relationship with Kurt at some point, with Amanda admitting she feels responsible for the brothers fighting with one another, that she's the one who betrayed Daniel, not Kurt. It's an interesting admission of guilt that colors Amanda in a unique way, but also highlights an issue with Kirkman's writing in this particular run. More specifically, how the women in the story are only important in relation to Daniel or Kurt. Like Daniel's girlfriend Autumn, a sex worker who Daniel saw when he was a priest, and inevitably saves from her pimp boyfriend and his abusive gang. Yes, they get into a healthy relationship that's nice to see, as well as Kirkman avoiding a sort of love triangle between her and Daniel's new roommate, but she doesn't do more beyond bang Daniel and just comfort him in his time of need. Sure, these women have positions of power or show how badass they are in some moments, but more often than not, characters like Beth, who becomes head of the agency after the surprise murder of their former commander, is fairly ineffectual and are used as victims or stake builders for the main conflict. The only female character who isn't treated like this is the one recurring antagonist that's actually Cool's wife, Cobra. The covert ops agent who is mortally wounded by Haunt, his face reconstructed to look like a snake's, seeking revenge for his horrific injury. Cobra becomes the one recurring antagonist that's actually fun to see in action, unlike the main antagonist of the first run, Simon Herg. Now, Simon Herg isn't a terrible villain. His gimmick isn't outright explained, but is pretty understandable given the themes and setup for the book. He's a man who wants to live forever, have the finer things in life at his disposal, and he'll do anything to keep himself at that level. And that includes sex. Lots and lots of sex. Now when you put Herg like that, he sounds more interesting than he actually is. He's an oligarch who wants to stay in control for as long as he can, but he does nothing really interesting that other crime lord supervillains haven't done before. He's beefy like the Kingpin, money-hungry like the Kingpin, and can somehow survive 100-foot falls just like the Kingpin. At least his plan to sell genetically altered super soldiers is different, but I digress. By the time Herg is captured and made a secondary player, the book had finally moved on to an actual supernatural antagonist in this ghost-themed superhero story. The Apparition. A being specifically made to seek out and destroy ghosts like Kurt, the Apparition poses the challenge of what Daniel's new perfect life would be like if he didn't have his brother watching his back. And while the question that poses is intriguing, the end result is fairly unremarkable. So get this, the Bolivian test subject that told Daniel and Kurt that they were a haunt has a vague connection to the spirit world. So when Daniel goes searching for her to help with the apparition, she comes to him to warn that if Kurt is caught again, he'll cease to exist. Of course, this happens anyways, and Kurt returns after Daniel's left in a coma, but that's only after not God, again this isn't God, brings Kurt into not purgatory to talk about his purpose as a haunt. How he'll need to do something to pass on to the next life, whatever that may be, but even not God doesn't know what that is. But if the apparition keeps coming after him, not God will bring Kurt back every time. So when Kurt is brought back to the land of the living, Allegria, the test subject who Autumn is jealous of, takes the two's soul signature into herself, being devoured by the apparition. This stops the creature from going after the brothers, but leaves Kurt remorseful for once in his life about a seemingly innocent woman sacrificing herself for their sake. And given he's dead, Kurt can't do anything to fix that. Again, it's an interesting idea for Kurt's development to give him grief this late into the game, all while Daniel lives the perfect life he never lived. And while this is technically the final arc before, well, we'll get into it, I can't help but feel like there's a lot of missed potential with it. Remember when I said Daniel was a priest? Yeah, the book seems to forget that sometimes too. Despite becoming a man of the cloth who preaches God's word, if not reluctantly, there's a lack of Christian iconography or attempts at rewriting biblical lore in their own way. I get that Spawn isn't a series that quotes the Bible verse for verse, but the idea of a superhero priest physically haunted by his past is a really cool idea. One that the secret agent stuff of Haunt somewhat gets in the way of. While Daniel does develop interesting relationships at the agency, like with Beth or the nerd character that ultimately makes him open up more, it gets in the way of what could have been a more supernatural, horror-focused superhero romp. Instead, we just get special ops violence with the occasional supervillain. And that's not bad, but it was clearly not enough to sustain the book long-term, especially for those involved. Now, sales for Haunt were never that high. Around the time of its release, it was reported that comic book shops had ordered over 60,000 copies for its first issue. Not a bad number at all for a new IP from Image, but a far cry from the 1 million copies that Spawn #1 inevitably sold. Then, as the series rolled along, it slowly but surely dipped its way out of the top 300 comics sold month to month. It didn't help that Otley had to pull out after 5 issues and Greg Capullo around 18, given both had full plates, but the biggest blow to the work was the announcement that Robert Kirkman, the man who initiated Haunt's creation in the first place, would be leaving the project to focus on The Walking Dead, which by the time of Haunt's release was exploding in popularity due to the TV show and inevitably the Telltale video game. So Todd McFarlane was the only one left of the original creators of Haunt and its first issue. He still had a fan base and an active Facebook group, plus by then he had made more money off of McFarlane toys, so the desire to keep Haunt around past Kirkman's tenure made sense. Todd, however, instead of stepping up to the plate for writing and inking, just stuck to inking Haunt, and in turn gave the reins to writer Joe Casey and artist Nathan Fox, who, despite having plenty to work with after Kirkman left, said, "Fuck it,
I'm gonna do my own thing."
Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the changes made to the series ultimately changed its trajectory, and in turn, its sales. Let's talk about the setup. So you know how I said that Daniel was a priest, a typical Catholic one in a New York church? Yeah, throw that out the fucking window. It turns out that he was instead recruited by the Second Church of the Burning Bible, a techno-cult based with its own apocalyptic doctrine that's existed in the shadows for centuries, taking root in New York City as a means of spreading its influence and through its priest, their doctrine. Daniel somehow didn't realize that the church he was working for wasn't the kind of church he grew up in. And after he finds the agency's base abandoned and experiences apocalyptic visions of the future, is kidnapped by the Second Church and their super soldier paladins. But not before Kurt, a now much more antagonistic figure to his brother, takes over his haunt and tries to let loose, killing Autumn in the process. While Daniel is tortured by the Second Church, Kurt taunts him and his failures before the two are saved by an exorcist named Still Harvey Tubman. Still Harvey Tubman is the last of the Conductors, a group of ghost hunters who've existed for centuries hunting down haunts, as well as fighting against the Second Church. So with his newfound mentor and desire to discover what happened to the life he once lived, Daniel and Kurt must work together to stay out of sight from the Second Church, all the while mastering the mysterious powers that being a haunt gives them. Now this is a radical shift. The art style change to me is the book's benefit, giving it a feeling similar to Daniel Warren Johnson's work or that of Kill 6 Billion Demons. Nathan Fox injects a lot more horror and a lot more personality into the artwork. That's not to say the work of Otley and Capullo didn't have a personality, but it's less standard Big 2 and more indie chaos. Well, that definitely makes some of the action less impactful given the larger focus on tendrils and fire and all that supernatural stuff. The destruction is much more visceral, and pages have a lot more going on. That's in no small part due to Joe Casey's script, which as a fellow NYU grad I gotta give credit to, go Violets. Now, there's justification to the resentment, given Kurt is a fucking dick in this run. He abandons his brother for his own sake, wants to constantly take over as Haunt when they fuse. He even hates Still Harvey Tubman, despite the fact Harvey can see him plain as day. Daniel, by extension, is both dumber, given the backstory I explained, but also a lot more anxious as a person. He's constantly on edge and thrown through the biggest ringer possible in these 10 issues. He gets visions of the future he doesn't want to come to pass, gets burned and beaten over and over again. He deals with trauma ghosts of his own girlfriend before the end of the series. And while it's handled, well, fine, it doesn't really excuse the fridging that had to happen to get this storyline. But again, I digress. The second church fills that missing religious gap I felt with the first run. And while it completely ignores the stuff with the apparition and not God to make it work, the Warhammer-esque iconography and heavy focus on religious conspiracies make the second church a much more compelling antagonist than something like Simon Herg. At least visually. There's a lot of things ignored from the previous Kirkman run that would definitely piss off fans if they were reading. But sadly, not many people were. On top of a sudden cliffhanger ending that just kills off Still Harvey Tubman at the last second to bookend any potential plots with him, the book sold particularly badly during the second run. Like, not even trackable on the top 500 bad. And it's kind of a shame. I'm gonna say a hot take, but I actually prefer the Casey Fox era of Haunt to Kirkman-McFarlane. It not only dives deeper into the body horror and pseudo-religious elements that I like from Spawn, but it also carves its own niche in that universe that allows Daniel and Kurt to exist on their own. This idea that Daniel and Kurt's fusion is unnatural, that they shouldn't exist under the light of some kind of god, is a much more compelling theme to me for a ghost-themed superhero. And the fact that it took 2/3 of its run to get back to that core idea set up all the way in issue 3 is sort of emblematic of the issues Haunt faced as an ongoing comic book. A lack of vision for its longevity, something that the changing of hands didn't necessarily help. After issue number 28, Haunt officially became part of the Spawn universe, something confirmed by Todd way back in the beginning of Casey and Fox's run. But from here on out, Daniel and Kurt only appeared periodically to either give big warnings to the then current Spawn Jim Downing about his living costume, before inevitably returning to obscurity. Though that would change in 2021, when Daniel and Kurt returned for the first time in almost a decade during the top-selling comic of that year, King Spawn #1, which completely changes his characterization. Again. This time, everything that happened in Casey and Fox's run is completely ignored, just like Kirkman's! Now enough time has passed in-universe for Daniel to get a new girlfriend, who, poisons him, since she was secretly an angel. After being put into a temporary frenzy, Daniel and Kurt team up with the original Spawn, Al Simmons, as he begs Al periodically to help him find a cure. This new version of Daniel and Kurt, written by Rory McConville, definitely tries to tie Haunt into Spawn canon by at least saying Al and Kurt had run into each other before, given the nature of their jobs. But beyond that, it doesn't do much to acknowledge the prior canon, instead making Daniel seem too ineffectual for his own good, relying on Al before inevitably trying to betray him given the source of his cure is somewhere in the dead zones, which is a Spawn thing I don't have time to explain. Well, Daniel and Kurt would inevitably be shuttered off into Todd's obligatory team book for Spawn called The Scorched, which is a particularly bad name, I might add. Nothing of note has actually happened with the character since. Sure, he tried leaving the team and told Kurt to go away as if he's not the one in control of that sort of thing, but he came back in time for Spawn number 364 as part of Spawn's cavalry, effectively rebooting him again under Todd's writing for the next person who gets their grubby little hands on Haunt. A character that Todd, by this point, had made a figure of, and nothing else merch-wise. And if Todd isn't milking a design he made for multiple figures and cameos and all that sort of media goodness he's good for, clearly something's wrong. The failure of Haunt is kind of similar to your average D&D campaign. You have a bunch of really cool people trying to do something based on the things that they like, and already worked for other stories, but because of inconsistent schedules and a lack of interest, shifted gears into something completely different. And when that completely different thing didn't work, the people left in the group decided to give up and, on occasion, offhandedly reference the campaign in question with a wistful desire to go back. Even though they never will. While Kirkman's idea for Todd McFarlane to have a second major ongoing series was certainly ambitious for a millionaire like Todd, it's clear he'd rather just crank out more Spawn than experiment in any meaningful way with his art. He's a businessman after all. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And if it's already broken, well, try to make more money off it anyways. Ah well, Here's hoping Haunt cameos and Invincible like he did in the comic. And thank you for watching.